Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for the third and final part of the Q&As this week. So let's go ahead and get this started. All right, first question. Why do people say 5x5 doesn't work long term? Can I pick 6 exercises, weighted chin dip, squat, deadlift, push press, power clean, add reps, sets, and weight periodically, and spam this approach for a decade? All right, good question. Sure, you can do this for a decade straight. The problem with sticking with the same weight scheme, basically 5x5 is a basic rep and set scheme. It generally assumes if you're going near failure that you're using the same basic weight for years on end. The problem is that when you train the exact same sort of workloads, the same volume, same intensity, everything, you do tend to reach plateaus to where you stall, you slow down and everything. That's why periodization was invented. Is to give you a little bit faster progress, to program things in a way that prevents stalls, to get around the laws of adaptation, to get around the point where the body stalls in gaining strength and muscle. Now, that being said, you could do this indefinitely. You could definitely do this indefinitely. You're just going to gain a little slower. The way that you've got to look at it, though, also, the other issue is that 5x5 is a lot of workload with a moderately heavy weight. You're generally talking about working at around 80% of your max, sometimes going up as high as 85, and doing 25 reps on big, heavy movements. And you're generally doing them 3 times a week. That's 25 reps with over 80% of your max, done 3 times a week. When you start doing that on big movements like deadlifts, power cleans, all that stuff, the problem is it starts to become too much workload for a lot of people to handle. It's fine when you're only able to deadlift 300 pounds. For 5 reps. But when you get to the point to where you're pulling 450 for 5 reps, stop and think about that for a minute. 5 sets of 5 with 450 done 2 or 3 times a week. The tonnage you're moving at that point, a lot of people are simply going to struggle to recover from that. Until drugs come into the mix, and even then, what happens when you get to where you're doing 500 pounds? The same drug stack that let you recover from 450 might not let you recover from 500 for 5 sets of 5 done multiple times a week. So the problem you run into is one of workload eventually. And so what you will have to do, if you wanted to stick with 5x5 because you said, you know what, I love 5x5, this is what I want to do, this is how I want to train for the next decade, you are going to have to rotate through heavy, medium, and light days. You are going to have days where you come in and cut the weight back 20%, or you're going to have to cut back the number of days that you train. That's the problem that you run into. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself having to deload really, really frequently. So there's a couple issues with it. One of bypassing the law of adaptation, which just means you go a little slower if you don't work around it. But there's also the factor of maximum recoverable volume, maximum recoverable tonnage, all of that stuff will eventually play a role. I mean, 5x5 is relatively heavy, and it's a lot of workload. And like I said, you start getting into these big, explosive, heavy barbell movements, and you start doing that sort of tonnage every week, you will reach a threshold to where 5x5 is just simply too much for you to recover from unless you start scaling some of it back a bit. And that's just the way that it is. So that's why people say it doesn't work long term, but nothing works long term. Everything needs to be rotated and changed a little bit, particularly as you get bigger and stronger, you adapt. All right, next question. If you've been training for nearly 15 years and your fat-free mass index is in the 24 range, will training bodybuilding split versus, let's say, more frequency like full body 3 times a week or upper lower, would it have much difference in terms of building more muscle even though you're already at your full genetic muscle potential? All right, let's talk about that for a moment. Briefly, that 24 assumes that you're very, very lean. If you're running around at 18% body fat, you could probably go a lot higher than 24 on the fat-free mass index. However, I think it is fair to say that anyone who's drug-free and at a 24 fat-free mass index is going to make very, very slow gains from there. Because, yeah, it is possible at a higher body fat to hit a 26 or a 27. It's that when you start cutting down, you probably are going to cap out in the high 24s for most people, even relatively genetically gifted people. So keep that in mind. We're talking that 25 cap. We're talking about people who are under 10% body fat. There are plenty of guys out there who are, because they're fatter, they're fluffier, they eat a lot more food, who are above 25, even above 26. There are actually quite a few of them out there who probably are drug-free. So keep that in mind. Now, that being said, yeah, you start reaching a point of diminished returns, and are you going to see big differences? Probably not. But you know what? The way I would look at it, are you going to see any benefits from going to a split? Either no. Because you might reach a point where, you know, you're like, well, I've gotten this big. I'm probably only going to gain half a pound of muscle to a pound of muscle every year. But if you go over to a body part style split, you're probably going to gain a little less than that. Out of that little bit of muscle you're going to gain every year, you could be costing yourself a couple ounces of it. Will that matter in the grand scheme of things? Probably not. But you also have to factor in that you're also going to be sore, a little more sore. Maybe have less athletic ability, things like that, from doing the body part split routine where you've got a chest day, a leg day, an arm day, all that stuff. So there are other potential negatives to factor in there. But you know what? If you don't care about those things, it probably doesn't matter. That's the thing I'll tell people. At the end of the day, if you have a set of goals that aren't particularly affected by one style of training over another, and one of them is slightly less effective for your goals, but you happen to enjoy it more, which one do you think you should do? I would argue the one that you enjoy more. As long as it's not dangerous to you, do the one that you enjoy more. Do you know why? Because consistency in the gym is far more valuable than doing a perfect program. Doing a mediocre or decent program consistently, where at least you get the big lifts and at least you're progressing, that you do consistently and religiously, will always beat a vastly superior program that you half-ass and that you miss workouts and you're not consistent with. All right, that's the difference. So I'm going to say at the end of the day, sure, the full body would still probably be better, slightly better, but I would ask, which one do you enjoy doing the most? Because that's going to have the biggest long-term effect on your actual progress. All right, next question, and probably the last question of the week. Hey, Mr. Blaha, I have myself doing barbell rows twice a week in my current program. I would like to swap it for the pendlay row just on one of the days to train the more explosive power element. However, I'm still a novice. Should I or shouldn't I? Thanks for all the great videos. All right, brother, good question. Tough one to answer because you say you're a novice, but you don't say what your actual goals are. You're not saying what your goals are. What I would say to most novice lifters, having different days where you focus on different performance elements is probably not the best of ideas if you're not a competitive athlete of some type. If you're a competitive athlete, I may not recommend something like my novice program at all. So let's say you're talking about my novice program, I wouldn't recommend that. I would probably have a novice lifter go run something like starting strength with a little more extra explosive work added, a little more volume added. Go with a proven effective program, or maybe something like DeFranco's West Side for Skinny Bastards, in which you are having undulating days. But what I would say to the novice lifter who doesn't need specifically to train for explosiveness, you probably don't want to have days dedicated to explosiveness. You need to focus on learning your basic lifts, learning the motor patterns on those lifts so that you can excel at them ideally. You don't want to have a wide variety of exercises if you can avoid it as a novice lifter. You need to adapt to a handful of exercises, probably no more than 7 or 8. And if you're adapting to 2 different styles of rows, you're probably shortchanging yourself a little bit of your gains. So for a novice lifter in your case, I would say you need to pick one or the other. Just like I don't like to see a novice lifter rotate back squats and front squats. Intermediates, that's fine. You know, if I get an intermediate lifter who tells me, hey, I want to alternate A and B front squats and back squats because they want the different performance elements of each, I'll be like, hey, that's great, that's fine, because you can undulate your training in that way. For a novice lifter, you are shortchanging your overall progress because you really need to get really brutally strong at individual exercises, and rotating through them too much that are basically overlapping with others that you kind of need, probably not ideal. So I would say to you that if you're mixing pendlay one day and regular barbell rows another, you're probably progressing on both slightly slower. than you should be. So I would say pick one or the other. You either need to just focus on a regular barbell row and do that your 2 or 3 days a week for your full body, or you need to pick the pendlay row and focus on doing that. And I think I had said a while back that people who run my novice program, you know what, I originally wrote it for the regular row, but I'm a massive fan of the pendlay row, and if they want to do the pendlay row instead, I think it's acceptable. But I definitely wouldn't have people rotate through those. And people will ask the same thing, can I rotate flat bench with incline bench? No, probably not. You need to pick something and stick with it. You need to pick one and stick with it. Because again, unless it's a certain performance element, like I only have something like an overhead press being done every other workout because there's so much other pressing involved, that's a little bit different. But when you're trying to pick variations of the exact same exercise, you don't want to mix variations as a novice lifter. You really want to put your efforts into getting as strong as possible on one specific variation of an exercise, a very effective one that puts the most muscle on you, and use that to build your base. And then once you built your base, you can specialize and divert a little bit more. So honestly, you're going to be better off if you just pick one or the other and focus on getting as good as possible at that one exercise. You're going to be better for it a year from now. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.